out. I have to say, your episode. I told you this before, but I don't think you know the extent of it. But your episode is flying off the shelf in a way that has never been the case for me. Like literally, I can't even like I've gotten dozens of signups because of you.
Well,
So not only did I guilt sign up for your, although it wasn't guilt, it was pride. It was, and I've listened to a few episodes. I signed up for your Patreon. I listened to your Russia war retrospective, the part one so far. I missed. I think
yeah,
there's like a second one. That
two
was
more to come on that.
okay. Good, good, good. Yeah, that was very good. I'm so happy. So if you're listening to this, and you will be, because I'm gonna, even though I'm gonna put this for the patrons, I'm also gonna unlock it and for the main feed and for the YouTube channel too, to help sort of get people to go and check out the YouTube channel. It's still kind of it's still getting going, but thanks very much for having for coming back on the show, Alexander. So all of that preamble was a big thank you for you. I've lined my pockets with your episode, and also you're like you're like the perfect guest in a lot of ways because like I didn't even know what I was like talking about, and I'm just like, bro, tell me what's going on, and you just like unleashed, and you did it in this like linear fashion, and you moved through it very very precisely. So I thank you wholeheartedly for the great episode.
Well, I'd like to thank our beloved political class for providing such top line content. You really couldn't write this stuff.
It's like it's a cliche to do this, but it's like the entire like political life of the UK is just one never. It's like Benny Hill soundtrack on repeat, but like also like it's like the Benny Hill kind of like fast forwardness.
Oh yeah,
Like
well we
that's
had a
what it.
Benny Hill prime minister in Boris. I
Yeah, you
mean,
do.
it's basically like every time he would come into a room, if you imagine the Benny Hill music playing and then him like chasing women around a tree, that was basically what he was focused on in his entire premiership. Nothing else.
Bojo. Okay, so we people should go and listen to that episode, even if it's behind the paywall. But I was thinking for those poor people who can't afford the paywall, maybe we could kind of do a rundown of just the sheer like the kind of quick version of last week's episode if we can just like make our way in say like 5 minutes through the prime ministers because it just to just think about it and like it's 6 and 12 years, right? I think it's like six and something like that.
Yeah. So if we start off with a man who's made an appearance again recently, an unwelcome appearance, Mr. Gordon Brown, who's come out and said that Putin should be on trial for war crimes. I mean, this is the man who signed the checks for the Iraq war, after all, as our beloved Chancellor, which is our fancy version of saying finance minister. So he's in charge in the 2008 to 2010 recession, oversees the enormous bailout of the banks, is credited by the City of London as the man who saved the world, so to speak. So he then loses, or in a weird election which no one really wins, to David Cameron, this sort of loathsome ex-PR man who's like one of the who uniquely combines both of the most heinous features of the British capitalist class, which is being of the financial capitalist variety. That's what he comes from. That's what his father was, but also from being one of the oldest aristocratic families in Britain. So he combines both of them in one heinous body. So he's next, and he, of course, oversees he's a big pusher of the Libyan war. Him and Sarkozy are, of course, the big European supporters of that. He gambles on the Brexit referendum to keep his party together in the face of a challenge from Nigel Farage and the golf club set. And that gamble blows up in his face. And of course, then he resigns and you get the slow motion car crash of Theresa May, who lasts about 2 years. Then we have Benny Hill himself, Boris Johnson, who comes in and basically he is mostly a disaster for many different reasons. And he's a man who is solely motivated by egotistical short-term thinking, which is why the ruling class got rid of him. Then you have, of course, Liz Truss, who comes in and lasts about a month, most of which was taken up by the death of the former monarch, Queen Elizabeth, not quite the last, but she was replaced by Charles III and the last, hopefully. And then, of course, you get the dispatching of Liz Truss and an internal coup constructed by the governor of the Bank of England and various people in the Conservative Party for reasons we may want to get into later. And then, of course, we have the living proof that identity politics cannot trump imperialism, it's Rishi Sunak. The man who is making history by proving that an Indian guy can be just as bad as a buffoonish old Etonian, by overseeing, of course, the continuation of the proxy war in Ukraine and continuing to give the City of London everything it wants, aggressively trying to assert the fading power of British imperialism everywhere. And that's the current occupant of the position, soon to be replaced, I would think, within the next year or so by Sir Keir Starmer, the former chief prosecutor, current leader of the Labour Party, though not that you would notice at all. Him and Sunak are basically the same person. Then, of course, he is most famous for the persecution of Julian Assange, which he oversaw the beginning of that when he was chief prosecutor and urged the Swedes not to drop the allegations that were the basis of his detention in Britain. So that's the past running all the way into the future. A rundown of the horrors that perfidious Albion has to offer in terms of its political leadership, and more seriously, a reflection of the deep, deep crisis that British imperialism is in, because you don't go through 6 in 12 years without having a real problem. And on top of that, of course, we've got the implosion in Scotland, where Nicola Sturgeon has recently resigned due to many of the same problems.
Right. So we have a lot. I feel like that was great, and that people who really want to enjoy, and you can afford $5, you can go and listen to that conversation, because it was supposed to be on YouTube too. I screwed it up. You'll be all surprised to hear I screwed up the recording. However, because you really did elaborate the sort of like tectonic problems, or like the sort of deep structural problems, to use a better metaphor, of the UK economy, and how the sort of UK elite react to those sort of like constant crises and the need to like reinforce. So what you said right there, I was thinking, let's bounce off of that about Rishi Sunak. I mean, let's put aside the sort of like the stage we're at of like neoliberal capitalism, where like the representatives of a class are like the class elites have embraced the notion of diversity, right? That diversity is not something that is some like liberal idea, but in fact, it's a code word for expanding, and it's been true for a long time. I think it's been true there's always been elites of various stripes like incorporated into imperial systems, right? I mean, that's a feat, and that's unique. It's not unique. That's common trait to a lot of imperial system, is sort of like, how do you get parts of the colonized class on your side and help them and get them and subcontract to them your rule, essentially. I mean, putting that aside, like for a second, in terms of like the person of Rishi Sunak, can we talk a little bit about the actual coup itself? Because like this was, I mean, we said this in the episode, but it's still just like boggles my mind. Like they did a coup, and there was like and they did it in the open, and there was like no real problem with it. So there's like people didn't like neither in the masses or in like the elite themselves or in their media classes. Like it was just they pressed Control Z on Liz Truss, and it was fine. And like, which then raises the question, you're like, what is the purpose of these people if they could just be so like passed between like variables in some like Excel file, or is it the opposite, in that it actually is important, and that's why they had to resort to drastic measures like just doing a coup in the open? Because you said about London City, you were talking about the city of, he would never get into the city of London. In case people didn't understand that, you might want to explain that, because city means something very specific in the English context, right?
That City of London, in comparison to London, it is our version of Wall Street, or Wall Street is your version of our City of London. It's referred to in England as the square mile. It's the square mile right in the middle of London, where the financial district sits, and has done for, of course, hundreds and hundreds of years. It is, of course, linked organically to the Bank of England. It's where the bourgeois revolutions in Britain were arguably born back in the 17th century. The growing power of that class, fueled by the discovery of what became the United States of the Americas, fueled by the extortion and exploitation of those colonies, and the immense amount of gold that came into the system grew this bourgeois class to the point where the City of London and the merchant class that were more widely spread around London were the people who pushed forward the bourgeois revolution in Britain to get rid of the rule of the absolute monarchs. Since around about the 1650, with the beheading of the last absolute monarch, Charles I, the monarchy has been varying degrees of ceremonial only. The last one to try and do anything was James II, and he was deposed in a coup funded by the City of London to bring a Dutch king over to sit in his place. So this isn't new for us, you know, and that of course caused a little bit of a problem because it caused almost 60 years of counter-revolution, civil war, restorationist. It's called Jacobitism in this country. But I give that as the background because, again, this isn't new for us, you know. But what the remarkable thing about Truss is that, as I was saying on the previous episode, she was the choice of the Tory party rank and file. The ruling class did not want her because, A, they regarded her as an unreliable and frankly rather stupid figure, which she is. Let's make no bones about it. They didn't like Boris. They got rid of Boris earlier in the year because, again, they regarded him as too openly dishonest, too obviously crooked, too prone to do unpredictable things just because it suited him personally. And that's the thing about the ruling class that we've got to understand, which is that the positions that we're talking about, to answer your question, they are important in that it's important that the person who sits within them is entirely predictable. That's why they chose Joe Biden over Donald Trump. It's not that Donald Trump is a threat to US imperialism or anything stupid like that. It's that because Donald Trump is from outside of that imperial management system, in the same way Johnson is to a degree, and he has a base in the petty bourgeoisie which he has built based on his own fame and based on his own notoriety, and it's not purely dependent upon the bourgeois political machines, it's slightly independent. That's too much for them, because that introduces a degree of unpredictability into the system which it can ill afford. And it's the same with Johnson. Johnson was liked by the ruling class when he was just the goofy guy who was the Mayor of London. Mayor of London's a bullshit position largely. It's not got nothing on the powers of like the Mayor of New York, for instance. His job is to be a guy who goes around doing adverts for the tourist board. And a goofy guy with messy hair who can do a Benny Hill act, that's perfect for the London Tourist Board. That guy running the country, no. Because, first of all, he's too self-centered to be a reliable standard bearer for the ruling class. To be that, you need to be able to essentially agree to take one for the team, take one for the class, so to speak. So if that requires your sacrifice, if that requires you to resign, to endure public disgrace, to carry out very unpopular policies which are going to basically ruin and end your political career, then you, as a reliable soldier of the British ruling class, have to accept class discipline and do that. Now, Boris Johnson was a bit too unpredictable in that he had a base that was mainly of Brexit supporters, who he routinely betrayed and abused, of course, but he had that base out there and was associated by the ruling class with what they call the populist curse. That's what the media refers to it as. The period between 2015 to 16 and around about 2020 when COVID pretty much brought it to a close. And that's for those reasons they didn't trust him with the system. Now, to expand that, the British system is a lot more vulnerable than it appears, as is your own, as is the American imperial system, based as it is on a network of, shall we say, influencing operations, limited military campaigns, military bases across the world to enable the British ruling class to continue to keep resources being extracted, markets being exploited, labour being exploited, and to keep capital flowing into the City of London. And that's a very delicate thing to manage. And they don't want an oaf like Johnson in charge of it. And of course, EU membership was a very important part of that as well, in terms of furthering their ability to move capital around, draw on pools of labour in Eastern Europe and Central Europe that was highly qualified but would work cheaply. Now, Johnson was seen by them as being responsible for Brexit. Now, they had to put up with him to make sure that they got rid of Corbyn. But as soon as Corbyn was safely disposed of and the Labour Party had returned to its natural home, which is being run by a Knight of the Realm, and was safe for them, properly safe for them again, they could then get rid of Johnson, which they did. He'd made a lot of enemies, and getting rid of him was simply a matter of uniting them all and creating a storm in the media where then eventually he is told by the men who really matter, Boris, time's up, don't worry, you'll get a payoff. So he goes, and then, of course, the horrible mistake for the ruling class happens, which is that the Tory party MPs can't unite around a candidate, because if they can unite around a candidate, it doesn't have to go to the membership. And as I've said before, the Tory party membership is largely the sort of petty bourgeois base of used car dealers, small landowners, small businessmen, who are basically like one step away from fascism, usually. Very angry petty bourgeois types, but they're not meant to have any power in the British system. They are there to keep the Tory party alive in the areas where they live, to deliver leaflets, to be like a local voice, an on the ground influencer, so to speak, who can go around telling people to vote Tory because David, the used car salesman who sold you one that was pretty good last year, he swears that they're going to do good for the country. That kind of local guy who is, for some reason, trusted in a particular petty bourgeois community. That's what he's meant to do. He's not meant to have an influence over who gets to run the country. He's meant to follow orders. And the problem with Liz Truss was she was the choice of those guys who were pro-Brexit when the choice went out to the vote, the Tory party membership base. And they can't have that. They also can't have it that Truss had pinned her flag to Brexit, and they need Brexit undone. They need it undone because of the reasons why I've gone into before. They need that free movement of capital. They need also to be a outpost of US imperialism within the EU. And this is one of the things I didn't get into too much last time. US imperialism has a very complex relationship with Europe and has done since World War II. And Britain is one of the ways that US imperialism seeks to keep Europe firmly in its column. See, they're of course natural allies when it comes to, cracking down on communism, opposing the working class, supporting the exploitation or hyper-exploitation of the African nations. They're all on board with that. But they can't. US imperialism cannot have a Europe cohere together to form a serious alternative center of power. That was what they were worried about with West Germany in the 80s and the 70s. The re-emergence of the West German industrial base was threatening to American manufactured exports. On a broader level, it was what they were worried about with Japan in the 80s and the early 90s. It's why they forced the Plaza Accords on Japan, get it to tank its own currency and basically to tank its own economy, then steal its microprocessor businesses. So Britain's role within the EU is to act as a conduit for American imperialism. And because Britain's empire, such as it is now, rests upon the foundations of American militarism, then Britain must perform that task. And if Britain is not performing that task, then someone in the US political establishment might start to ask, well, where's the added value of Britain? And once that question gets asked seriously in Congress or by a presidential candidate, then there's real panic would set in, because without the US militarism, the British military on its own cannot sustain this imperial presence. So all these complicated reasons are playing out behind why they need a solid establishment figure in charge. And Truss, too stupid, publicly humiliated by Lavrov when she didn't know where the border of pre-existing Ukraine and Russia was. That sounds like just a funny thing, but like they would prefer their foreign secretaries to know where borders are, or at least be clever enough to defer to the ambassador. I mean, at least say, where's the border? But she couldn't even do that. So for all those reasons, they decide that we can't have her. We can't have this. So they get the Bank of England governor, a man called Andrew Bailey, basically comes out and declares that the mini budget that Truss's chancellor, a man called Kwasi Kwarteng, had unveiled was destabilizing the financial markets and was going to call into question the viability of British national debt, essentially. And once you call that into question, of course, the pound tanks. If the pound tanks, then you get this contagion running through the system of panic inside the markets. And once you reach that point, and you reach the point where not only the national debt, but the gigantic amount of personal debt and mortgage debt gets called into question because suddenly debt in Britain is not a safe investment anymore, then that's a crisis point. But they knew what they were doing. They knew that they could push the crisis. They could panic enough people in the Conservative Party to essentially say, Liz, you've got to go. And they were pretty sure that no one in the country other than these angry used car dealers would care enough, because nobody really gives a shit in the wider British public, in the working class and even much of the middle class now, over which particular Tory occupies the big chair, because the faith in the system has been draining for decades. So they figured they could get away with it, and they were right, which is that Liz Truss, other than a narrow layer of these petty bourgeois types, no one was going to go out in the streets for Liz Truss. Nobody. Yeah, no one went out in the streets for Boris Johnson either, and he was more popular. So this all reflects the huge instability whereby, again, to come back to your question, the position matters, and that's why it matters that having somebody who is completely predictable and will do what he's told or she's told by the officialdom and the financial markets via the medium of the governor of the Bank of England, and will be completely reliable. No deviation can be allowed. Even a deviation that takes it over to like more right-wing territory can be allowed. It's got to remain right where it is, and we've got to get back inside the EU. That's the overarching concern that they are finally beginning to pull off now. So that's the bigger shifts that are behind the Truss coup. And of course, now Rishi Sunak is in charge, a former banker. They're perfectly happy with it. As William Hague commented, our former foreign secretary got pranked by the two Russian guys, Vovin and Lexus, who ring up and pretend to be Poroshenko. And Hague, our former foreign minister, just such an idiot. He's just like, sounds Eastern. I'll speak to him. And then he revealed basically well, we got rid of Boris because he was a bit unreliable, and just spills the beans. So yes, that's the sort of the background issues here, and it just speaks to not only a fragility in the British imperial system, but also the fact that its legitimacy is draining away in politically speaking inside Britain itself.
Yeah, like you can. I can't help but sort of like do this thing because you get taught. I studied sort of British literature and British culture as part of my PhD. I did a PhD in Victorian lit, and even before that, throughout middle school, like you would get because I'm actually in Canada, but so we had the old vestiges of a kind of like I guess you would say sort of Great British Imperial history. So we learned about 1688, we learned about Cromwell. We learned like these characters, even if it was like pretty flimsy, that like it wasn't even boomer. It was like it was like boomers, like older boomers who were teaching us then. Like there's I'm talking the 90s, and today I really doubt they teach any of this stuff. They probably don't. Like Gen X and millennials have taken over teaching. Thank God. At least it's better than the boomers, I would feel. But but the thing is, like, it's funny to like listen to all of that and watch it unfold, and then like watch like the chaos of it all and like the Benny Hill politics of the Benny Hill nature of it, and then think that like this has taken 500 years of evolution, like to get to here. Like it took 500 years of like, this is like when people talk about liberal democracy, they're talking about the UK. Like they're talking about that parliament that was just couped. Because like it's really the oldest model of that we can really sort of say. I mean, it's obviously older than the American one. It's obviously older than the Canadian one. But like, forget its age. It's also its genetics. It's like political, juridical genetics are all over the world. So like, it is a kind of like Ursprung of like this kind of liberal democratic system. I mean, say what you will about like the inflection of like French politics and like German philosophy and blah blah blah. But like really it's like English economics that like made this, or like violently remade the world, and it made it in its own image. And like, I speak English for a reason, to you, like, so like to think that like this like seed of modernity, unfortunately for the world, like it really shouldn't have been, but it did, that look at how I mean, I hate this, fascists use this word, but really like look at how degenerated it's become in its own political system. Its sclerotic like nature is like showing And like this is 500 years in the making. So like everything we were promised by like the lies of like British imperial history are sort of like imagining itself as like, oh, and then they did this, and then they cut off this king's head, and then Parliament did this, and then Pitt the Elder, and then Lord Palmer's, like this kind of like the fact that I know these characters. I mean, forget the British PhD, like that's my own fault, fine. But like I knew these characters from before because Canada, you don't even have your own history, so it's like very weak. So you have to siphon it off of like British imperial nostalgia, right? Because ultimately Canada is filled with like Scots, Irish, English like settlers and the people like us who came afterwards as part of like immigration, right? That like is now subsequently hailed as like, oh, this great thing. But like the soup of it is English and like UK or whatever you want to say. And look at the state of things. Like, like this is, they had to coup someone who was around for 3 weeks.
Yes. Brilliant, isn't it? You know? But well, this is the thing. Like, you get around about 100 years of Britain as it became a rising power, which is like I would say probably from the beginning of the 17th century into the 18th century. In the 18th century, the borders of Britain are confirmed violently. In the case of like the internal civil war being brought to an end in 1745. And then, of course, the continued violent suppression of Ireland, where most of my ancestors come from. And that then sets the stage for, from 1745 to around about 1870, of the unprecedented period of British dominance. The British Empire comes into full being then.
Pax Britannica, baby.
Yeah, that's the point when it becomes the manufacturing powerhouse of not just Europe but the entire world, when it can use naval power to bludgeon down any barriers that are put in front of it.
It's destroyed its rivals in India. Any other China is gone. Like nobody is making stuff. They've destroyed the world economy.
Destroyed the Indian manufacturing base, and then have the nerve to say, "Oh, we left you a railway and cricket." There you go. I mean, that's still taught, by the way, in this country. For all the complaints about woke education, like the cornerstones of the British Empire are not being questioned. I don't care how much like right wingers moan about it. Like pulling down a statue.
No, they're obsessed with it still. They have the crown. They have all this incomplete, like
it's
the fiction is like this narcissistic glare of, oh, look at this intense personal drama of these families. Like,
it's all part of the propaganda system, really, in reality. Sometimes at least they used to make somewhat more entertaining propaganda. Now it's just dross. But there you go. But then the decline comes probably from the 1870s. That's the point where things start falling away, because it's the point that Lenin identifies as the moment that imperialism as a system of the export of capital starts to become the primary method of profit making in Britain by the British ruling class, because they can no longer make enough money via the production of commodities inside Britain. That's the point that you start getting the deindustrialization, which, again, both Hobson and then Lenin identified in the early 20th century, which is that the southeast of England got deindustrialized and turned into a leisure park for the rich. Because now it's export the capital to the colonies, build extraction facilities there, or make the commodities on site, because you can brutalize the labor even more effectively, because the working class here have become too obstreperous. So you export capital to what became Rhodesia or South Africa, or you continue to do the hyper-exploitation of India or Malaya, as it was called then. And that's the point where you start to see the real decay set in, but it doesn't become obvious. Of course, you see the problems really explode with World War I, because, of course, Germany, the great manufacturing power, rises at record speed and then becomes itself an imperialist power via the export of its capital, probably from the middle of the 1890s. So it's about 20 years behind, but it's catching up and it's impinging upon those British markets, which they regard as theirs. So that's really the cause of World War One. Nothing about archdukes getting shot in Bosnia or, little Belgium or anything like that. It's because British profits depended upon the keeping of that colonial empire so that the capital could continue to be exported to it. Not commodities, but capital itself. And then the decline is a long one, because the British ruling class were at the top of the world for so long, and then, as you said, made much of the world in their image, so that even when Britain leaves much of Africa, much of the Middle East, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Burma, all of these are left behind with these English or British legacies and a million ties to the imperial system that was then set up post World War II. And they were able to then hang on for another nearly 80 years after the end of World War II. But now that's ending. And that's what we're seeing. And of course, the other Anglo countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, won't be far behind in terms of their hitting a wall pretty soon. And the United States won't be too far behind, because, again, the United States has followed the path of British imperialism exactly, but with possibly even greater brutality and even greater greed in the end. But this is the path, and they're desperately trying to find a way to save themselves, faced with a world where basically the entire advanced capitalist system in the West is now facing the same problem of decaying imperialism. And they aren't able to pull themselves out of it, because, like, Biden can say, we're going to recreate manufacturing. But it's the same thing Trump said, by the way. Well, okay, the US ruling class doesn't want to invest in America. Look at the fucking railways.
They can't. All they can do is make like bombs and war machines. Like, that's it. Like, what can Americans make that like makes them money as an economy? Nothing. Like Coke, like sugary snacks. Like, how much can you make out of that? I mean, that's why real estate is such a big thing. Where you live too, right? Because real estate, especially where, say, I live in Toronto, like, they just took the air and they made money out of it by like sticking, and they called it a condo. Like, that's how and then they talk about diversity and all of this, like, oh, Canadian values, but in fact they're just recruiting rich people from abroad, educated people from abroad, who then like augment and buy real estate, who then kind of purchase their way into society. But ultimately, the foundation is stolen Indigenous land and support, and what keeps life going here is extractivism, right? Like, the famous joke is Canada is 3 mining corporations in a trench coat. Like, that's what we are. We're extractivists. I mean, like, it's interesting. The UK has no resources to exploit, and we only have resources to exploit in Canada. Like, that's the only economy we have.
We do have them. We just don't dig them up anymore. I mean, that's the thing. There's like around about 1,000 years worth of coal under Britain that they stopped coal mining 30 years ago now. There's the oil industry, of course, in the North Sea. And there are, of course, other metal deposits, but we don't extract from them because, again, like, everything is based upon, well, it's more profitable to get it from somewhere in the colonized world because we can brutalize them more effectively. So we left, many, many deposits of natural resources in the ground. We turned huge areas. I say we didn't do this. The ruling class did this. Turned huge areas of the countryside not into places where you can produce food for the population, but into leisure parks for the rich. That's what huge areas of Britain are all about. Grouse shooting, and it's what huge areas of Scottish land is about. And this is golf and grouse shooting. That's why Donald Trump loves Scotland. That and the fact that he's half Scottish, of course. But that's really what, to go back to Lenin, is when he said that the southeast of England was the first part to be turned into a leisure park for the rich. That's what all of Britain is, really. Yeah. And then you'll talk about the jobs in Britain. Well, what do you have? You have a tiny manufacturing base, which is based around like high value added manufacturing. That's similar thing with the United States. Like, this is what they're desperately trying to protect from the Chinese. It's that like top of the line sort of robotics, AI, quantum computing, which the Chinese, by the way, have long since sussed out. I mean, they've been making the components of it for years. Did these idiots really think they wouldn't reverse engineer it and just learn how to produce it themselves? I mean, Christ. But this is the problem now, which is like you have this class that rules Britain and the United States that is completely parasitic. There is, arguments to say that Marx makes that capitalism, of course, is a motor force for progress, but of course it's a completely contradictory one because it also creates all this destruction because it creates to the point where there's too much and then you get the collapse, and then you get growth again. But now you just have parasitism. This is like the ruling class cannot claim in Britain to be representative of anything other than, to use the Lenin's insult, coupon clipping. It's just people who get an income from various investments, largely overseas, and then essentially set up the political system to serve them. Of course, that's exactly what happens everywhere. But that's reflective of that the losing of that ability to extract from overseas is behind a lot of the crisis here. And the pressure that they feel from merely the fact that Russia isn't run by like the worst comprador elements anymore, or that their experiment in China failed because those comprador elements didn't emerge in the way that they wanted them to and seize power, which is why you find Bill Clinton writing mournful opinion pieces saying, oh, if only I'd promoted democracy more in Russia. What he means is, if only Putin had turned out to be the sober Yeltsin that they wanted. And because these countries didn't work, this didn't pan out the way they wanted. They hoped that, well, okay, if we trade with them, if we extract value from them, if we try and grow these elites over there, these rulers that will be bent to our will and be permanently tied to us, then it doesn't matter if their GDP increases because we own their system. Well, it didn't work. And now they're in a complete ferment and a complete panic because even relatively small nations in sub-Saharan Africa can turn around and say to France, fuck off. We don't want your CFR franc area anymore. We don't want you here anymore, Macron, even if you are stood on a box for the group photo. Get out. And this is what is causing the meltdown. This is why Josep Borrell, the EU foreign minister, is sounding like a sort of late period Heinrich Himmler, talking about the garden and the gardeners must prune out the wild vines that grow from outside. Like, there's a reason
the Ukraine
why
stuff really made them like mask off. Yeah, like completely.
But that's the thing. It's like, we get all these debates. I call them debates. Hysteria about like fascism and stuff like that over the last few years. Brexit is fascism. Trump is fascism. Well, nobody ever really asked what fascism is and where it comes from, which is fascism grows out of imperialism. And you just listen to how these European officials are speaking. Now they're under pressure. Now all the talk about diversity quotas and the equity agenda and greening Europe and all that out the window. It's we are civilization. We are using Ukraine as our shield of civilization to fend off what is basically described as a horde. In the form of the Russians.
The Slavs are coming. The
Slavic horde is coming, and we are using the heroic, mainly Slavs in Ukraine to fend them off. And you don't need to do too much digging to find like a fully in context Joseph Goebbels quote that sounds similar. Because again, this is a manifestation of imperialism in the most extreme form, and the biggest problem that the European ruling class really had with the Nazis was A, they turned out to be a little bit out of control, and B,
they were too successful at their own game. Yeah, they beat them at their own game, and they didn't respect the lines that British imperialists had managed to draw around the French and their other European rivals for so long.
Yeah, they aggressively broke out of what was supposed their role was supposed to be.
Yeah. They
were supposed to crush the working class in Germany and then go east and fight the Soviet Union. That was what they're supposed to do. They weren't supposed to come west.
Yeah.
But the reason why I make the point is because like that understanding of fascism that I've briefly outlined there, that's in my view, the most correct version of it. And it's a version that nobody in the liberal intelligentsia, of course, wants to have anything to do with because they're busy proving that they are one step away from it themselves with this whole Russia and China thing.
I also think that and this is also a communist problem, like the category of fascism is such like it's hell. First of all, there's a huge problem. There's the deeper issue. And I'll start with the deeper issue and then we can go to the simpler issue, which is people use like the Third Reich as the highest avatar of human evil, which is just wrong. Is just like simply wrong. Like and that convenient sort of slight historical kind of sleight of hand in terms of like making like Nazism as some kind of like high point of European savagery is itself racist, like insanely racist, because like because you're saying that, oh, when they did it to everybody else around the fucking planet for 500 years, when the Spanish did it, the Dutch did it, the French did it, the like Portuguese did it, literally everyone in Europe did what the Nazis did, and for longer. Okay, for actual longer amount of time, and yet you hold out these guys as this like particularly like as the highest point, the apex of evil. I mean, that is the deeper thing, but it's also like, which is obviously like benefit to the British ruling class because it conveniently erases 400 years of like, or like I guess 400 years of like the most violent, like, or maybe second most violent, depending. And I kind of don't. I'm of the view that you shouldn't break up the U.S. and the U.K. in terms of its global calamity, that it's like two phases.
We belong together and we'll sink together.
Yeah, like that. It's two phases of a kind of European settler colonial project at which these two powers kind of are the head of, and they kind of tag team each other with the other parties. But like ultimately, it's the same kind of like global struggle of settlers versus indigenous people. But like the convenient thing though is that inside of that political system that manufactures this abroad, right? Like that, like when like the hate and the like genocidal lust gets turned inwards and gets shown to like the people who they call citizens, right? As opposed to like, you know, people you're occupying, like that's somehow considered some form of like political evil, right? That like that this is like this is an amazing sort of sleight of hand that like the imperialists have managed to pull over like huge numbers of even middle class educated people too, who like just forget this fact that like everything you think the Nazis did and they did do to like, you know, to Europe, you guys did to the rest of the world, like, and then some in far greater numbers. I mean, this is always the problem of like talking about Iran, that like everything evil you think happens in Iran, forget Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, DPRK, everything bad that happens or you imagine happens 10 times over in the country called the US or another country called Israel, or like God knows how many other countries around the world. So like it's the very, very effective and very sort of like widespread collapsing or sort of like conveniently curating of certain kinds of political evil and certain kinds of political crimes, you know, to the point where like Americans, women who like liberal women or who conservative too, who like don't have the right to abortion, who don't have free healthcare, who don't have maternity leave, who don't have any kind of things that Iranian women have, they're sitting there like cutting their hair for some theoretical Iranian women in like an act of solidarity. Like there's a huge amount of like ideological force that's put upon us in this part of the world. And so much of it has to like requires us to sort of find objects of exceptionally bad evils around the world and place our hands in like them. And like, oh, you know, if we just cure this evil regime in Syria, then all things will be good, right? But like ultimately, it's like, bro, the evil regime rules over you way longer and they do way more damage to your life than you think that like another bad guy does to like his people. I mean, it's crazy. It's actually crazy the degree to which people are like divorced from reality of like their own political regime and are able to kind of manufacture, you know, evils abroad, which they don't manufacture. They just inherit like hook, line, and sinker from the stupid liberal media. But yeah.
Well, it's an interesting one to draw upon what you were saying there about the World War II in general is like a great piece of mythology for the British ruling class.
Yeah.
Because they, first of all, their manipulation originally was to have themselves not fight in it. It was to get the Nazis to go and attack the USSR, and then whoever wins will be more easy to take out. So there was that plan initially. That goes wrong. And then they have to adapt and frantically try to survive against a much more industrially powerful country in the form of the Germans. But to draw from your example, like it's exactly right. With the crime of the Nazis from the point of view of the ruling class in Britain, especially, was that they brought all those tactics into the garden, so to speak. Yeah. Whereas even in World War II, the British starved to death. I believe it was between 4 to 5 million Indians in Bengal. Yeah. Like it was quite deliberately done. We carried on exporting food from India all the way through the war. They knew what was happening and they let it go on. And
yeah, they did the same to Iran a bit earlier too. Yeah, no, this just the genocidal force throughout the world
Yeah.
And it's like uncalculable.
And we did it at the end of the 19th century as well. There were multiple famines in India. And of course, we bring it right the way back home. We starved Ireland to the point of depopulating it, you know?
Yeah.
So
And
this
it's never
isn't
recovered.
never recovered.
It's never
No.
recovered.
It
Like,
was, I believe it was around about 8 million in the beginning
yeah,
of the 1840s. That was the population there. Now, I think it's around about between 5 and 6 million
yeah,
population of Ireland. Never recovered. And just glossed over completely.
yep,
And when like Irish people mention it, like particularly like middle class English people get very angry. It's like, oh, why are you
yeah,
still talking about that? It's like, well, they still haven't recovered from it,
yeah.
you know?
And like they're so angry at the IRA still. Like they're angry at the IRA. Think of the tiny amount of violence that the IRA inflicted on the English, and think about in comparison to what the other way around, to like eradicating their indigenous language, for God's sakes, basically. Like, it doesn't, I mean, it still exists obviously, and it's like, but like majority of the population doesn't speak it, right? Like,
Majority, it's only like rural areas, really, like
yeah,
on the West Coast.
yeah,
And the reason why they hate the IRA so much, just to divert into that for a moment, is because the IRA hit people and institutions that
yeah,
matter to them. That's the thing that
yeah.
really gets to them. Like when they blew up that devious old sex offender Lord Mountbatten on his boat, that really upset them, and the fact that they came to within about a couple of meters of killing Margaret Thatcher. Same
Right.
with John Major. When you do that to them, they get scared and very, very angry, and that frightened them.
Yeah.
So that's the reason why they can't let that particular one go. There's the reason why so many of them are still enraged about it. But the point, just to reiterate about the whole World War II thing, that became such a source of re-legitimation for them internally and to sell themselves externally as well. Oh, we fought against fascism. Well, you fought against the product of a system which you are the premier example of, really.
Yeah.
There would have been, I mean, and also directly responsible for it in terms of like the fact that they deliberately pushed ruinous terms on Germany at the end of the World War One. Like that was a big part of the reason why fascism emerged, and of course they welcomed fascism as the great anti-communist alternative, both in Italy and in Germany, and of course in Spain and Portugal. So like.
Yeah. Yeah,
You're
the
up
Spain
to
was
your necks
fascist
in this
until the
shit.
mid 70s, for God's sakes.
Yeah.
They had no problem with fascism. Like it's crazy. It's great. They like
No,
fascism. Fascism is not a problem
not
because
a problem if you
it's
need it.
Spider-Man meme pointing at himself.
Yeah. If they reach the point where they need to violently reassert their rule domestically because the working class has got too out of hand, then fascism is the way to do it. What you militarize the angry, dispossessed, often ruined petty bourgeois, you turn them loose upon the domestic working class, and then you bring them back into the system, that is the militarized petty bourgeois, as like street enforcers, and then you have to violently turn outside again for a war of conquest. Because that's the only way you can keep this going in terms of actually reinvigorating the capitalist system domestically. So it immediately leads to a violent war of conquest, because that's what the system needs. But again, like this all grows out of the system, and the fact that they could play acts as anti-fascist for years. I mean, you said it. You said in previously it's also a bit of a communist problem, and I kind of agree, because like the propaganda from the USSR for many years afterwards did emphasize the common anti-fascist front. And now you can sort of understand doing that for propaganda purposes, but I think for many people on the British left, they bought into it. Like the alliance with the British and the US imperialists was one of necessity for the USSR, which I think the leadership in the Stalin era understood. The leadership in the Khrushchev era wanted desperately to get back to being all friends, even though, of course, it's impossible. But the fact that that was reiterated for so long kind of got a lot of people inside the British left, combined with the legacy of social democracy, to buy into this idea of like that Britain is somehow anti-fascist, which is just not true.
No.
It's so you still get people like getting angry about, rightly angry, when they see like British ministers going over and shaking hands with Azov, saying, "Well, didn't we fight against fascism?" And I'm like, "Well, not really. No, we fought against. They fought
You
against.
are the baddies."
Yeah,
That's what's so perfect about that like skit that like I don't think David Mitchum realizes is like, no, bro, like You don't need to dress up like a Nazi for that skin to be funny. Just dress up like an Englishman. Yeah, you are the baddies. And like that deep level of denial of like needing others to be your baddies. I mean, the US is still occupying Germany, and look what they did to Germany. They punished Germany because they did a little bit too much Ostpolitik. They could have one. I was thinking about this. I was like, wait, was their problem that they had Nord Stream 2? Was it that they allowed one to happen and they said, okay, you get to have one? But then when 2 came online, they were like, no, you can't do that. And like, that's American imperialism in a nutshell, that said, okay, you can have a little bit, but you can't have a lot. And that's how it treats its allies. Now imagine how it treats its own, like its enemies. It's crazy.
Well, yeah, I think the thing with Nord Stream was that they always opposed any of it. They didn't want any of it happening at all. They were forced to like swallow certain things from Willy Brandt in the 70s because they needed to keep that alliance together with a greater degree of urgency because of the Soviet threat was more real. When you get to the sort of degenerated capitalist Russia of the 90s, like they didn't really mind the Germans buying more energy from them, as long as, of course, the Russian comprador class was firmly in charge.
Yeah.
When it became obvious that wasn't the case anymore, that's when Obama starts getting twitchy. Of course, then you get the coup in Ukraine. But then you go into Trump, and he's desperate to stop it. By the time you get to the growth of the war last year, that point, Biden or whoever made the decision says, right, fuck it, we'll blow it up. Or in the words of Bill O'Reilly, we'll do it live.
Fuck it, we'll do it live.
Fuck it, we'll blow it up.
It's true.
But that's the point where they've decided that no deviation is acceptable anymore. It's dawned on them that they're going into this gigantic crisis. They need all of their allies, or vassals would be the most appropriate usage of the term, because that's how the American imperial rulers see these countries. It's like, no, you have no agency at all. Yeah. Your job, we will occasionally look after your interests in like the Middle East or Africa as long as you're going along with us. You try and strike out on your own, you're really on your own. And they know they can't make it on their own. So
they
that's why
couldn't
they're
even do
all
the Suez
subservient.
crisis. They tried the Suez crisis. That blew up. They couldn't even take over one measly little trade corridor. Well, they got smacked down by Uncle Sam. I mean, think about these are the people, like the same group of people who like reigned over, like possibly, well, it's 56, right? So maybe some people, not really. They're probably from the ghosts of the 19th century, or some people who had been in power since, like, say, like the 1910s or something. Like they had seen a huge amount of like the world underneath the so-called Union Jack or whatever, like, and now they can't even go into Egypt with their little poster with their forward base colony called Israel and like do like a good old-fashioned ultra-violence and and clear themselves up of this nasty little problem called Nasser. Like they couldn't even do that because like they got smacked down by the true masters. And I can't help but feel that like the German, like, it was like the fact that like the U.S. blew up Nord Stream. It wasn't even just like the sale of the gas, because it was also that cheap gas was the seed of their entire industrial economy, right?
Yeah,
so with one little bomb, with one little operation that probably took 30 people, they affected the lives, or let's say even 100 people, but they affected the lives of hundreds of millions, because it wasn't just Germany. It was all those countries downstream, right? Because these other countries that were just living off of these cheap gas, because Germany was even selling the cheap gas that they were getting. Like they had so much of it. And, you know, like the fact that like Russia allowed that is like so strange in retrospect. Now that they like, because I guess it makes sense that they were like, well, let's kill them with kindness, so to speak, and like sell them this energy that we have so much of, and then sort of like, you know, it's the carrot and the stick approach, I guess. But Americans are all stick, I guess, and how they run their little empire. But you know, I mean, I've said this before. No other group of people deserve it more than Europeans to like have themselves ruled over by these like disgusting psycho freak meth heads in Washington. That like, yeah, good. Now you can experience what like you did to the planet, just a little bit, tiny little taste.
They've earned it for a long time. I mean, looking back at the Cold War era, it really was the era of grand illusions, because
Yeah.
there was the grand illusion of social democracy, all funded, of course, by imperialism in various different ways, either hyper-exploitation of the colonial world, increased domestic exploitation of the working class, or loans from the United States. And that illusion of social democracy is really powerful, and like it animates all of left politics in Britain
Yep.
and in France and in Germany, Italy too. Like
That's how you get the Greens. That's how you get the Greens, who are like the most pro-fascist like party out there. They go along with every crazy like imperialist regime change scheme. Like with left people like that, what do you need right wingers for?
Well, you don't need many fascists when you've got Annalena Baerbock screaming for more war with Russia. But I mean, the fatal illusions of the post-war period are all sort of haunting us to this day, because this is what cripples, to a large degree, the development of anything outside of like social democracy in Britain, in terms of even those who call themselves Marxists. They're all hooked on it. They all want to go back to the period from 1945 to 1951, where like you got big trade unions, you could be a communist member of parliament, you were accepted in the public sphere. It's all, of course, based on like a series of like historical accidents that a unique combination of circumstances which cannot be repeated, and in many cases is not desirable to be repeated either, or shouldn't be desirable. But we're still, this is what animated the Corbyn project. It's complete nostalgia for the social democracy, the image of social democracy, rather than the realities of it, the grubby realities of it. Nobody really wants to talk about, which is the fact that the British Labour Party is as much a bunch of rabid imperialists as anybody in the Conservative Party. Just look at some of the statements that the front benchers made, the leaders of the British Labour Party government made between 45 and 51. Like, they were desperate to keep hold of all the colonies. They didn't want India to go. Not really. They were forced out. They didn't want to lose anywhere else. They ran that vicious war in what's now Malaysia, killing like thousands of Malaysian peasants who had dared to be associated with the communists. They ran Yemen, of course, but they also ran the brutal suppression of independence movements in places like Kenya. That's all the Labour Party. And you read some of these people's views on the colonized peoples, and like it's like anything Churchill said, it is easily matched by the people in the Labour Party. But the British left, no matter how revolutionary they say they are, or like how much they hate the Labour Party, when it comes to election time, it's all back to social democracy. Either voting Labour or trying to set up a new social democratic alternative, which is basically another version of the Labour Party. And until we decisively dump that, and we're going to be forced to, because the British imperialism's not got a lot of juice left in it at this stage, it will have to be a reckoning, which will involve jettisoning that, first of all, critiquing that legacy properly and reckoning with it, but then also building something that goes beyond that. Because if we keep on this nostalgia trip, well, then we're going to get another useless Jeremy Corbyn impersonator in a few years' time when Keir Starmer blows it all up, but with even less room for manoeuvre, because British, as we were covering with Liz Truss, British capitalism has no room for manoeuvre anymore. You have to remain within this very narrow boundary, which is why Rishi Sunak has effectively started the process of rejoining the EU, which will be a great thing to do when the EU implodes in on itself. So you're jumping onto the Titanic as it's going down. But with no room for manoeuvre at all, with no Soviet Union there to provide a powerful example of something different, with no powerful trade union movement, even though that comes with, somewhat mixed blessings in terms of the leadership of it. Okay, well, what do we do? Do we continue to live in the land of like old imperial illusions? Or do we actually move forward and reckon with, well, what the hell do we need to do to get rid of this parasitical class, which if it can't destroy the rest of the world in terms of its exploitation of it, it is going to turn inwards and destroy us. And basically you can then, whatever happened like in the 1930s in Germany, will end up looking like a picnic when these people, having had, as you said, 500 years of milking and exploiting the rest of the planet, particularly in the last 150, suddenly have to turn inwards. Well, what do we think that's going to look like? It's not going to be pretty.
Yeah.
Now, of course, that comes with risks for them as well, because they've not had to go that hard at it for a long time. But we'll need to, we those of us who consider ourselves to be communists, Marxists, people who want to replace this system, we have to take a very long, hard consideration of our legacies and how we build in for the future. Because if we don't, then we're going to get basically just stuck on some horrible treadmill when the ruling class gets more and more ruthless towards us, and we will not be ready for it.
I mean, yeah, they've used COVID as an excuse not only to like murder huge swaths of like the working classes, which is like in effect what happened, because when you just let people and you don't like support people for like protecting their own lives and unleash them, and like people die because they had to go and like, you know, serve chicken at Popeyes one day, like that is like an act of class violence. And they used COVID to unleash class violence directly and then indirectly in the form of so-called inflation, which is price gouging, that they're using COVID to like inflate the price of, you know, or they curate these insanely violent wars, which they use as an excuse to inflate the price of energy, for instance, right? Like this violent the amount of class violence has gone up. Now, I do think we do have a model out there that is akin to like what the kind of counter model that, or sort of the counterpoise that, or counterfactual, let's say, or counter example, whatever you want to call it, that the USSR used to provide for the liberal West, so-called, which is China. But China's own, like the quality of life in China, like the cost of living of China, like the state, the like all the various things that show Chinese life to be like people. There's a reason why Chinese people are more like satisfied with their own government, way more satisfied, and endorse it than say that it reflects our views than any of our countries here, where like no government ever enjoys more than 30% support. Like 35 is good, right? Like the Trudeau regime that I live under, like the guy is hated and he's the son of a guy who did it 50 years ago. Like, wow, congratulations. Gee, that's not a very creative solution. But like that was the answer to like neoliberalism's crises in Canada. They're like, okay, just give him more of that Trudeau special sauce, and like make him wear a t-shirt that says, this is what feminist looks like.
Yeah, have him go on a movement, a protest movement against himself.
Yeah, with Greta. Yeah, it's the best. Like like if hegemony was like a person, it would be like Justin Trudeau. Like in terms of like everything. And so like that, I feel like, so I think that China does provide a counterexample. However, Orientalism kicks in, and this is where 500 and like 1,000 years, depending on how you time it, like of like Orientalist fear-mongering about, or like fear-mongering around like the Oriental hordes to the east. And it's always been flexible over time, and it can be easily adjusted to cover different kinds of Easterners. That I think that actively gets in the way of people ever considering that, like, hey man, why is life so affordable in China? How come they don't have the kind of problems we have? How come they don't, like, you know, for like, you know, so like why ask those questions of like, oh, who runs the governments in those countries? That yes, there are these, you know, people always, you know, of course Trots always say this, but other morons too, but like, oh, you know, the existence of billionaires in China, it's like, yes, they do exist, but who controls them? And it's not the other way around, right? Like we know that billionaires control our state, the kind of states that we live in, but on the other way around, it's the states that control the billionaires. And that's ultimately like one of the reflections of like the accomplishments of Chinese communism, that whatever you want to say about the existence, the theoretical, like however it might like mismatches your ideal of a communist society or a socialist society. And then we could get into the question of like, what is a communist state? Does it exist? Blah, 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 blah. Like putting that aside, but like you can objectively say that like the accomplishments of the Chinese Communist Party are undeniable in terms of lifting people out of poverty, improving access, like quality of life across the board, right? That like all those things were like accomplishments that we should, like communists in the West, should look up to and say like, oh, we could emulate that. We could bring lots of people out of our own sections of poverty, and that, you know, but it's that which capitalists could do too easily, right? But they choose not to because that's not the nature of their class rule. Their class rule is antagonistic, parasitic, as you put it. They can't, like, there are these moments of so-called social democracy where they throw you a few crumbs. But look, I live in one of those supposedly social democratic countries. It's oil and fucking minerals and timber that fuels our free healthcare. Nothing else. It's not like good vibes, right? Like it's not like it's not anything good. It's like the extractivist economy that is the basis, and that's also true for like the European social, like namely the so-called whatever, like what's the thing that
Nordic model.
The Nordic model. Oh yeah, you mean oil? Is that the Nordic model? Is that what Iraq had too under the Baathists? It was the Nordic model. Yeah, it's called oil, bro. Like, what do you want to do? So like that I feel is something that we can, but we have too much Orientalism in our genes, in our cultural genes to stop that. Like I feel that like, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it'll take a couple of generations. And maybe even sooner too. Maybe like there will be a sort of threshold where like people will just accept the fact that like a large swath of the earth that's happy with itself doesn't look like us, doesn't talk like us, doesn't eat like us, doesn't live like us, which is like a problem for capitalism. Capitalism needs to reproduce its world in its own image, so that like what isn't in its own image is like revulsion, is like, you know, repulsing and whatever, right? So like this I feel is a logical problem that I don't think existed with the USSR. Yes, there was a kind of there was a kind of racialization effort. There was, I feel, that of like, I mean, we didn't live during then, or we lived at the very end of it, but like I certainly, there was this kind of racialization, sure, in the Cold War of like, you know, Slavs versus or whatever, like USSR hordes. However, I think there was an operation of whiteness that does operate, and it does successfully operate, that can say humanize someone like, say, Stalin, if you want to use the example that like communists of a certain class love to fetishize, but not save that for Mao. I mean, I don't think that's you across the board, but like, you know what I mean? Like that, I think that like what stops them is just, you know, it's that Orientalism thing, nothing more. Like there's no reason it should, is what I'm saying.
I think when it comes to Stalin, he was, of course, a man of the Caucasus. He is not only despised by the Westerners, but despised by the Russian nationalists as well, who like to consider themselves part of the grand old Europe. But on the China thing is a very interesting point, because, of course, for China to have achieved the things that it undoubtedly has, what do they have to do first and foremost, which is dump parasitic landlordism and kick out the imperialists, be they Japanese, American, or British, or any of the other European powers that had so-called concessions on the coast of China. They had to destroy all that first and foremost, and then they could do things like double the life expectancy in 30 years. So by the time Mao dies, people are living to the late 70s, where they've been dying in their mid-30s in the 1940s. That, of course, never gets talked about. But the point is that they are able to then build off that and, you know, engage in this 40-year process of what Xi calls sometimes market socialism, sometimes socialism with Chinese characteristics, but it's able to be built. They're able to exercise the control they do over the capital they have allowed in, because they so thoroughly basically extirpated the compradors, the old feudal elements, those that were tied directly to imperialism, and they were able to set the terms by which capital came into the country. Now, for us to go near some of those examples, our first step is, well, we have to eradicate parasitism in this society. Now, so that is our first step. And what stops us from doing that? Well, quite a lot. I mean, part of it is that they are readily able to demonize the Chinese example, as you say, but also parasitism at the top. The way these economies are designed now, they're almost like inverted pyramids. You have like this large number of, or relatively large number of parasites in like the top, between 1% and 5%, top 5% probably, with only the top 1% really having the serious wealth. But then you have a much bigger number of petty bourgeois beneath that, who are the legitimators and the carriers of its ideology. And then you have layers beneath that serve them. And then I say it's an inverted pyramid because it's balanced on what in Marxist terms is called the productive working class at home, which is relatively small. Now, if we're going to turn that over, then we need to, first of all, come face to face with the reality of it, which is like, you need to be telling people, look, there's a reason why they're running all this bullshit in the press about, hate the Chinese, or hate the Russians, or be afraid of this, that, or the other. It's simply because it's don't look at the man behind the curtain. Don't look at the man behind the curtain who is responsible for your neighborhood falling into disarray. For the fact that if you're living in certain parts of the United States, chemical trains keep derailing because, of course, their railways are a model of parasitism because they get all this subsidy from the federal government, goes straight to a share buyback, a stock buyback, no investment in the actual track, no investment in the infrastructure, whole thing falling apart. It's just pure parasitism. But of course, that's not discussed. And it's the job of communists to go out there and to be unafraid to not only say that, but also, look, this is why they're telling you that, got to fight Russia over there. They're doing that for them and their class. It is not going to advantage you. There may have been a point where the imperialists could say, oh, well, we fund our concessions with the loot of empire, and that would be true. But not happening anymore, increasingly not happening. They are only going to be using that to protect their own assets, protect their own class interests. So we have to break the spell. We have to punch through that. It's going to be a tough job, but the ruling class are going to help us because they are now going to be put into a position where they have to turn on the domestic working class and even part of the domestic middle class. Because now, and this is why we should all welcome the defeat of imperialism in Ukraine, horrific though that war is, and the consequences of it. But we should be very clear that that is a war that imperialism chose. That is a war that US imperialism and their horrendous British butler chose to make with the domestic Ukrainian compradors in the belief that they could somehow engineer a regime change in Russia. The Russians spent 8 years trying not to fight it. As Putin said himself, they could have rolled up to Kiev in 2014 and knocked this whole thing over. They didn't do that because, and this is where I drift away from most of the British left, I would say that under Lenin's terms, Russia isn't an imperialist country at this stage. Not at this stage. It's an exporter of commodities, not capital. It exports some capital, but nothing like what we do or the US does or the Western Europeans do. And if you look at the attitude of the Russian ruling class towards the war in Ukraine, they were the biggest barrier to there being one. If you compare the Russian ruling class's attitude before 1914 and the Russian ruling class's attitude in 2014, it's like night and day. 2014, they were invested in imperialism. They were all on board with seizing land in Eastern Europe. 2014, they were desperate not to have any conflict because they just wanted to sell their commodities to the European market, which is why it takes Putin, being a cautious Bonapartist ruler, 8 years to essentially get to the point where they can think about doing that, think about actually having that war. And again, British left found wanting on that as well, not explaining it to you when you need to be direct to the working class. Even if that truth is not accepted for a long time, you still need to say it. It is no good engaging in this fantasy about Russian or Chinese imperialism based on nothing, based on an analysis which is completely false.
What happened to the talk of great powers? Can we just can great powers just simply exist, and then you can just be against the great power politics of Russia, and you don't have to call it imperialists. You can just it doesn't have to be a good thing. You can just, a great power can have reactionary politics that you find personally disagreeable, and this is also a trap, I feel, of the era. However you feel about whatever's happening, that China and Russia are great powers, but where are their empire? Where are their imperial? Where's the viceroy of Belarus? That you may, okay, let's say a Ukrainian nationalist is on the show. They say, oh, that's Lukashenko. Lukashenko is his viceroy. But it's do you how do you feel that these countries relate to each other? Do you think that it's a question of is it the vassal? Is it the vassal state that that Germany and France and to a certain extent UK are to the US? Do you really see that kind of the fact that the politicians don't change in a place in a place like Belarus? Is that more a reflection of the fact that Belarus is some under the thumb of some authoritarian leader, which I guess, someone could say, sure, like if you want to say that, like that's you could say that. I mean, I think that's personally wrong, but like ultimately for us to be sitting there and nitpicking the situations in other countries where like, like where we can temporarily extract ourselves from our positions in the global West, in the global North, as part of like the tentacles of the U.S. empire. I mean, it's like to me, I find that absurd to like sit there and like talk about like Russian imperialism when you are doing imperialism in the country you live in. Like it's like it's the Spider-Man meme again.
Yeah.
Now and again, like I don't even think that like you even have to even say, you could still disagree with, you could still be anti-Putin, you could still be pro-Ukraine and not call Russia imperialist. You could just say that, oh, it's just like this great power that's like pushing its weight around, that's like not respecting whatever, it's Ukrainian sovereignty. Like you could say that, and like I won't, like you could just have an argument about that. But like the fact that people need to remake every single geopolitical situation like in the same mold of like the US and the UK, because that's all they've ever known, that's like the only frame of reference that they have, that like, and then which is like how you get the Xinjiang stuff, that like people can think that people living in like America, which is like, which has more spies in mosques around the US than like any other country, that like kills more Muslims than any other country and has, and like facilitates the death of Muslims in all parts of the world, that like that you can say and talk about Uyghur genocide like with a straight face. I mean, that is an insane accomplishment of Orientalism. I feel that like people can like make that, like this is the country that has Gitmo. Like they have a torture prison on the occupied Cuba. That's like a double whammy of imperialism.
Yeah, well, I mean, the interesting fact about the whole Belarus thing. I mean, I was actually just doing some reading about that this morning for like one of my own programs about the year-long anniversary of the Russian special military operation. Like, okay, Belarus, run by the same guy nominally from 1994 onwards, but that is, if to be crude about it, that's an incredibly surface-level analysis of what's actually gone on in that country.
Yeah.
Now, I've only just started getting to grips with its history because I was reading up on the whole Union State Treaty between them and the Russians and what the actual relationship is there. Like Lukashenko, again, a Bonapartist ruler in the classic sense of the term, comes in at a time of great crisis, clamps down upon in a very brutal fashion, but a very effective fashion, the mafia and the comprador elements in the country, basically runs it as a very heavily state-controlled state capitalist operation for nearly 30 years. There's problems there, admittedly. No, I'm not going to try and sugarcoat the guy. But when you compare that to the country next door of Ukraine, well, would that they had a Lukashenko, quite bluntly, about it. Because, Ukraine has had a lot of elections, some supposedly fair, some not fair. You got various Canadian and British heinous bastards going over there in 2003 and 4 for the Orange Revolution and making hysterical speeches about democracy and freedom. Well, okay, where did it get them? If you compare put the two countries alongside each other, Belarus and Ukraine, which one is better off? Which one is it better to be a working class person in today? Belarus, again, had its problems, but it retained more of its industrial base. It retained more control over its resources and its country than Ukraine, which has been literally ripped apart by vultures, and was done with the full cooperation of the comprador ruling class there, that was more than happy to play the same role it did with the Germans in the 1940s, which is of turning Ukraine into a site of resource extraction for one empire or another. The Germans wanted it in 1914 to 18. They wanted it again for its agricultural capacity in 1940 to 45. And now various multinationals with the Americans and the Dutch at the head of it are buying up all the same agricultural, very fertile, black soil land. So now it's Monsanto, Cargill, the Vanguard Group and BlackRock buying it all up from these horrendous parasites who stole it off the Ukrainian working class in the early 1990s. So
when you want to look west and you want to be Western, that's what that means. Yeah. Like if you're out there and you're listening to this and you're like living in a country that you're like, well, I wish we could join that Western alliance. This this is your West. Like, this is
Yeah.
what you get. You get Monsanto, you get monopoly capitalism, and you take your position in the global resource extraction industry, like take in the
Yeah.
global supply chain. Just take your position and shut the fuck up.
You
and
are
be
a
happy.
regional manager, basically.
Yeah, you're a franchisee of your own country. And that's your job, and shut the fuck up if you can't do that. The Poles do it. Huge part, like other countries around the European continent do it. You know, like they sliced up the western half of the Soviet Union very well, and they kept huge chunks of it, and they were like spiking the football, and they even tried to break off Russia itself through its support in Chechnya and also in the Caucasus. And actually, it's funny in some ways, and I don't feel like we talk about this enough, but I probably should get someone on to talk about this. And you should join me, because I feel like you'd be a good person to talk about this with as well. Is that the trial run for what they did in Ukraine was in Georgia, right?
Yeah.
Like they did this. They put a guy in there. He was their chosen little boy, their little golden retriever, Saakashvili, and he was celebrated by the same group of neocons, and he sold off his country happily, and he did it in the name of fighting those Russians, and in the name of going, like, go west, young man. Like, this is like that siren's call is very powerful, and I feel that, like, there are millions and tens of millions of, you could even say hundreds of millions of people around the world in different countries who hear this call, and it's true for Iran too. That, like, they hear the call of the West, they say, oh, if we just didn't piss them off so much, if we just made deals with them and we got on their side and we, like, stopped pissing them off with these annoying issues, they would just leave us alone and we could have all the good stuff, and we wouldn't be. It's like, sorry, let me tell you, even if you make a deal with them, they'll pull their backs on and they'll fuck you over, and they won't even, forget the JCPOA, forget fucking the Minsk agreements. Ask the indigenous peoples here what a deal with imperialists is worth. Okay, they don't keep their deals. That's the whole point, is that it's their way or the highway. And one of the solutions is, you get the guy, the hardliner, who's the old institution, and you back him up. Like, that's how you get guys like Lukashenko. That's how you get guys like, to a certain degree, like Bashar al-Assad, right? That's also how you get guys like Aliyev. But Aliyev you never hear of. Gee, I wonder why. Like, Aliyev has been running, or the guy in Turkmenistan. What's his name? I forget. He handed it off to his son. I mean, these are like dynastic countries, and there's a ton of them around the world. But we pick some of them to say, oh, those ones are bad and these ones are good, right? But I don't know. Maybe the root of all this, and this is to go back to the British example, it's like, democracy's not all that great. Like, liberal democracy does not work out very well, because, like, you're living in it. How well is it working out for you? How well is it?
Well, that's the thing. It's like, these were never meant to be universal values. These were the values of a particular class who were forced to talk in universalist terms because they needed to convince the lower classes to fight for them. In the English Civil War, in the American Revolution and War of Independence, in all the other bourgeois revolutions, they needed the proletarians and the peasantry to come on board with them. So they had to talk in universalist terms. Of course, it was never meant to be applied, you know? It wasn't, and that's the thing. It's like, and it wasn't, and when you get to the 1990s, and that, God, like the amount of bullshit shoveled in through British academia into the former colonized world then about democracy.
Like the Berlin Wall metaphor. Like, how many times were you shown that footage? But a ton of what they never tell you is that a ton of East Berliners didn't want the wall to fall. They wanted to keep their situation, or if they wanted it to fall, they didn't want to lose their privileges, because they lived a good life in the DDR. They were proud of it. A ton of them still are too. It's crazy. Yeah. It's crazy the degree to which the 90s, they just were drunk on their own success.
Yeah, but the thing is, they didn't win. What happened was the
USSR lost. Yeah.
The Soviet side lost, and it lost because of internal rot. Now, part of that, of course, it's a dialectical process. So part of that is because of this power of imperialism in terms of its raw economic power, its ability to dominate and control whole areas of the world, and also stemming from that, the fact that you got within the Communist Party of the Soviet Union especially, and the Chinese Party too, this is what Mao struggled against for so long, the growth of revisionism and even capitalist restorationist tendencies, and of course pure compradorism grew up within the system. Now, Khrushchev then lets all of that loose for 30 years. It becomes ever more worse, and you get the steady restoration of market relations in a very uncontrolled and very corrupt fashion inside the USSR and the Eastern Bloc, to the point where you get to 1989, where the top of the party in the state is rotten completely, where you get the working class still wants to retain some elements of the system, but there's no leadership there to fight for that anymore. It's already gone. They've already gone over to the other side. And that's like the Gorbachev example, and then you get the more extreme example of Yeltsin, Anatoly Sobchak, people like that. You get an example, that's the classic example where the top goes rotten and it distances itself from what was supposed to be the party of the proletariat. But by the time 1990 rolls around, doesn't matter whether you're in Yugoslavia or East Germany or the USSR, the proletariat is demobilized and demoralized. And so you get these reactionary tendencies often run by like petty bourgeois adventurers who can then step forward and essentially destroy a whole system, because the central rod, the foundation that held that up, has gone. It's all, and the party just implodes from the top. And that's why you see relatively small forces, like in the Balkan Wars, for instance. Like the number of forces that the nationalists could put out there was sizable, but it wasn't huge. It wasn't anything like the size of Tito's army in the 40s. But because like the political authority that used to run the country had just gone, vanished, disappeared, they were able to run riot. Of course, with the full support of imperialism, which enabled them to do much of this. But that's the big lesson, one of the big lessons to learn from that period leading up to 1989 to 91. It didn't happen overnight. It took 30 years of decay and corrosion and the growth back of capitalism and the growth of just outright corruption and criminality and the restoration of like bourgeois relations in many respects that enabled someone like Gorbachev just to pull the plug. And then the whole system just went because, again, it was the fish had gone rotten from the head. And that's the big lesson I was reading recently about Xi Jinping, and one of the things that animates him is apparently his study of the late period Soviet party and his desire to not have the same thing happen in the Chinese party, which is why apparently he was so concerned and remains concerned about this anti-corruption drive, because he saw those tendencies, the liquidationist tendencies as they were called, developing, comprador tendencies developing, which is essentially what I think he was cracking down on. Because he looked at the late period Soviet Union and said, okay, well, we need to eliminate this, otherwise the same thing is going to happen to us. And that's why, again, that's why the US imperialists essentially, part of the reason why they've gone so mad and they're so obsessed with Xi as a person, even though it's because he's not just him, he's a representative of a much bigger, broader organization. But they can't think in those terms. It has to be the emperor. It has to be portrayed as if this is still like the Qing dynasty or something.
Yeah.
But again, like the fact that the Chinese have at least learnt from that. They have studied that situation. They are trying to counter it. And the reason why I think that the CPC example is very interesting is because that party still has a vitality and a life to it and a connection with the masses that no political party in the West has. Even if there's certain aspects of it which, I'm not Chinese.
Even close. Not even close. Nothing.
Not even close. So then they have their People's Congress, which I think they are at the moment. Like they have this huge body gathered from all over the country, including people who, from the poorest elements of society, who you would never see in the House of Commons, as it is called.
That is way more democratic than anything that we have. Like that's the thing. Like that's what you have to realize, that like the things that like are sold to you as autocratic, this and that, like Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, like these countries are run by their people way more than the countries you and I live in. Our countries are run by oligarchies, aging aristocrat oligarchies, and their henchmen. And our only access to it is through like a class of media dorks who operate as their go-between. right?
Yeah.
As like who manufacture and market whatever crazy scheme they have going. I mean, that's essentially our political life. And every
Yeah.
10 and every 2 or 4 years, we're told to go into a booth and pick one idiot or another and like shut the fuck up after that. Like
Yeah.
that's really what we think of as democracy. And like until people are like honest about what our own political systems are, we're getting nowhere. We are getting nowhere. Like the people's obsession with Iran and like that you get that like this is what the I think Iranian diaspora is so important for, is that you manufacture this country Iran as this like exceptional place. But like, buddy, like you think you think Iranian deep state is like these people, you think the IRGC runs the Iranian state. Let me tell you about something called the CIA and like and like the scale of like everything, once again, like everything you imagine happens in other countries, they happen in your own. If you're a person of the global north, they happen. And on top of that, like if you're like part of the periphery of the global north, which is to say, if you're not in the fucking US, like your country is subject to the freaks in Washington. Like on top of the fact that you're ruled over a class of freaks, those freaks themselves have their own freaks to answer to. And that's what like the Germans just are learning. That's what the French are learning. That like, holy shit, these people are ruthless even with us. And they're like loyal servants. Like Macron is like a loyal servant of, and Schultz and Merkel, loyal servants of the imperialist West. And they still had their economies exploded. Like they got sanctioned. They just didn't call it that. They called it the Nord Stream explosion.
Well, yes, and like the US is now going to force all of them, or try to force all of them, to cut off relations with China. That's the next move.
Yep.
And that's the move that Biden is trying to pull now. And the political dynamics in Germany, it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out, because of course Germany, or West Germany, was one of the first to set up a joint operation, Volkswagen, in the PRC back in the early 1980s. So they've had now a 43-year-long economic relationship with the PRC. And basically Biden, or whoever the hell is writing Biden's lines for him, is going to turn around and say, well, that's very nice, Chancellor Schultz, but now you're going to be buying American, basically. So all those,
crazy, man.
And again, like that's going to gut the high value added manufacturing base of the German economy, because they've outsourced loads of stuff to the Chinese as well. So like you look at a lot of German manufacturing, the what they would call the basic stuff is done in China. The high value added stuff is done in Germany, and then they finally bring it together and make it in Germany. You cut that off, that's a huge problem for the German economy, because it's not going to be such a problem for the Chinese, because they'll just say, okay, well, we've studied all the high value tech anyway. We know how to make it. We're just going to mobilize more of our immense resources and replace you, Herr Schultz. Very interesting thing happened. Like Schultz got an hour-long meeting with Xi Jinping when he went over there, and Xi Jinping basically read him the Riot Act and told him to fuck off. Like, to go back to Germany and stop being silly. Lukashenko got a 4-hour meeting with Xi Jinping recently. So it tells you like the priority that that the Chinese leadership is now putting on making sure their alliances are solidified up. And it's clear that Xi and the other Chinese leaders, they know what's coming. They know that the Germans and the French and the other European buffoons are all going to basically cut their own throats. Because in the end, Macron and Schultz, maybe not Schultz, but like certain other very loyal servants of America in Europe, let's say the Baltic states or Poland, and certainly in Ukraine, when it all goes to shit, which it will, well, many of these guys are going to get on the plane and go to the retirement mansion in Miami or some other place in the States, because that's where they all go. It's where the retired South American dictators end up, some non-job in a US university somewhere, teaching, I don't know, public policy and defending democracy in an age of disinformation or something like that. But this is what's going to happen with like all these guys. They're going to get on the plane and they're going to go. And that's that's with our own beloved Prime Minister. There was a controversy of the fact that Sunak still has a US green card. Because, again, he's got an exit route for when this all falls down. And this is another thing that even these like lower petty bourgeois types need to realize. You're not special to them. They have contempt for you. Coming back to the Liz Truss thing. When you tried to have an opinion, they said, that's nice. There you go. That's that. Have that. Mr. Used Car Dealer from Essex.
Yeah.
That's what we think of your opinions, because this isn't about you. This is about
Yeah.
making sure that never-ending spinning wheel continues, the money coming in and the money going out, and the debt keeps getting financed. And if you get in the way of that, we will crush you as if you were a anti-colonialist in 1950s Kenya, because
Yeah.
we don't care. You know, we might you might be useful to us today. If you're not useful to us, that's it. You're gone.
That's it.
And again, I say this out of great love for my fellow Britons, because we're not bad sorts when it comes down to it. But a lot of people in this country and the wider West need to wake up, which is this is the end, or the beginning of the end. This is the point where the rest of the world, through by hook or by crook, develops to the point where we cannot dictate to them anymore. Our ruling class cannot go to the Germans now can't lecture to the Namibians anymore, and rightly so, having killed 1 million of them before World War One. Why should they? When they go over there and try and give lectures, the Namibians say, "Who are you? Get out!
Yeah.
We don't want you. We didn't want you here. We don't need you
Everything
here."
that the West could offer them, China gives them and more. And like
China gives
that's the
better
thing. Like we
deals.
really whether you like people are crazy, like, oh, do we live in of course we live in a multipolar world. That's what the crisis of that's what the crisis of the Imperial West is actually about. The fact that it's flailing around, unable to stop the tide or stem the tide, whatever you want to say, like about the fact that like, yeah, there's a new dog in town, and like it will everything that like the West could have offered to like the so-called global South, whatever, China offers at a fraction of the price in terms of political price. Like it doesn't like, what was the last country that China violently invaded and occupied and like killed 1 million people? Like it doesn't need to do that for its economy. I mean, it's strange. The irony, the sort of strange historical irony that the promise of like capitalism, the promise of like Smithian economics, or like the fantasy, whatever you want to call it, of like the market, in some ways, like the Chinese are actually the like standard bearers of it way more effectively than the people who invented it, namely like the Anglo-American settler elite, whatever. Like in a weird way, like Chinese people and their like corporations and their industrial manufacturing sector, and they're like basically being the workshop of the world. Like they've lived up to that promise way more than any English or like American corporation or German corporation ever has. Way more.
Well, because they've managed to retain the large elements of that socialist system. They are still, I would argue, retain large elements of the dictatorship of the proletariat within China, and that's one of the part of the reason why I don't think you can qualify it as an imperialist country. Even though it does export some capital, it does so in different ways than the British or the Americans would do. And of course, they are dealing with countries that are now that have a degree of sovereignty and can actually negotiate contracts with the Chinese in a way that the British and the Americans don't negotiate. They never have. It's like, well, it's either this or we find a guy in the army who'll take over because he went to Sandhurst or went to college in the United States, and he's willing to kill you for very little money. That's our way of negotiating. So is it any wonder why this is all going to hell? I mean, just look back at the example of when there was that uprising in Sri Lanka and they tried to blame it on Chinese debt. When you just do a cursory dive into the figures, 3/4 of the debt is owed to America and Western Europe. And they're the ones that are insisting on like heavily extractivist policies to enforce that debt. So like this, we can't escape from this model until this model is forcibly dismantled. It's going to keep flailing. And of course, the dangerous thing is, well, what if they manage to stumble into some sort of confrontation? Because it's a confrontation they're probably not going to win. And that's the worry over the nuclear war options and things like that, which I don't think is going to happen, because the US ruling class is so degenerate when it comes to something like Taiwan. They'll try and get the Japanese to act as their bullet stoppers for them. I don't think that they're capable of or actually will go in themselves. I think they'll try and shove the Taiwanese into the firing line, and if that doesn't work, try and shove the Japanese into the firing line, because the American political system is a lot more brittle than it appears, especially when it would come to things like heavy casualties. The thing I always go back to is like, even in the state of like late stage Ba'athist Iraq, could have put up more of a damaging fight against that American invasion than it ended up doing. It could have potentially caused more damage, lasted longer, caused more political problems internally for the Bush administration. Yes, it was very weak and was crippled, but potentially, I've read some interesting critiques from like some Maoists and communist thinkers who say that if they'd fought in slightly different ways, that they could have damaged that US invasion that was run on such a tight number of men and resources that could have caused much more problems for the US in terms of casualties than it ended up doing. It was lucky for the US that that went as smoothly as it did in the end. It could easily have backfired. And the point I'm making by raising this is that system is no longer capable of taking huge casualties. I think it is. I think the level
there's no
of
more
political
soft targets.
legitimacy-
There's no more soft targets, which is kind of the same thing. It's kind of the same thing as what you're saying, because the whole thing with a soft target is that it's a soft target, is that you can get it without much damage. And so, yeah, the U.S. lost 5,000 people, but they're still occupying Iraqi oil fields. They're still getting all that money is still being washed through New York. Like they're still occupying Syria, which they didn't even have to like do very much. They just subcontracted it out to a bunch of other, like through the Gulf partners and through Western mercenaries, Western-backed mercenaries. Like it's like they have the resources and the tools that they can subcontract their geopolitical chaos. However, the enemies that they're coming up against are no longer weak and starved, right? I mean, that's the same problem with Iran. If they could have done to Iran what they did to Iraq, they would have done it decades ago, but they couldn't. Is that Iran holds, like I saw a tweet yesterday, basically has a gun to the head of the entire region and into the West in the sense, because like you start a war in Iran, there's no more oil. There's no more Middle Eastern oil. That's it. It's done. That's it. It's just like Oman becomes Iran. Bahrain becomes Iran. Like Saudi Arabia doesn't exist, right? And like all that money, like the Suez Canal stops functioning, like because of the Yemeni allies. Like, I mean, I've said this before, is that the real story of the Iraq War, and to a certain degree, Libya too, in 2011, is that like those leaders had no friends to back them up. They had no allies and they had no structures. And so that's, I think, part of the story. And to go back to Belarus, is that like in this world, you like, if you're a small country, you make an alliance with a bigger country. What is the nature of that alliance? Now that's a specific thing that has to do with it. We know what the nature of the U.S. alliance is with every other country it allies with. It's vassalage. Yeah. Does Russia have vassalage with Belarus? No. I would say it doesn't. Does Russia have vassalage with Syria? No. Those are those. I mean, you could talk about like the balance of power. You could talk about like, you know, like who benefits from it. Okay. But is it anything like the relationship between like America and its so-called allies? Hell no. Because the fundamental nature of those geopolitical projects called the U.S. versus Russia are different. And same goes for China. Same goes for Iran. I mean, Iranian foreign policy isn't global domination. Like Russian foreign policy isn't global domination. U.S. foreign policy is global domination. Oh, yeah. That's the goal of U.S. foreign policy. The open goal is that and that's why it's an empire, right? Like that's why all the previous European empires just joined with them, right? The ones that existed, except for, and what was the ones that didn't exist? Russia. Gee, I wonder what happened to that European empire. It got dismantled from the inside by the communists because they're not imperialists. Yeah, like this is a crazy thing. Like people's literacy and their inability to see the world and like separate things and like judge them based on their own merits, judge like, you know, like you can, in the same breath, liberals who scream about Kosovo, like they completely don't think of like the legitimacy of Donbass. Like the same people. It's like, okay, which one is it? Like, which one is it? Is it minority rights and then voting for sovereignty and then you break them away and then right to protect and intervene and all that stuff? Or is it sovereignty? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, the sacredness of national sovereignty. You can't have it both. And like, that's what they want. They wanted both.
Well, it's whatever the imperial interest is at the time. That's basically
exactly.
That's what's really that's the invaluable service that's being provided at the moment. The mask has been ripped off, and it is just a matter of raw self-interest. And the more that gets exposed, of course, the angrier they get, because they need stuff like, you know, rules-based international order, which is an empty phrase, or democracies versus dictatorships, which again, empty phrase.
Toddler brain.
Yeah, it's all that stuff that like it was effective during the Cold War for a while, because and again this goes back to my one of my bugbears with social democracy being that like social democracy is one of their most effective advertising methods in the Cold War. This idea that oh no, you don't have to be like the commies in the East, you don't have to be like America,
Yeah.
you can be like Sweden. Of course, that got the rug pulled from under it like 40 years ago and has been ever since. And that's before we get to even all the stuff about like the fact that a lot of this is of course underpinned by imperialism. But without all that going, and like they're desperately casting around to try and find something to mobilize ideologically around, and they're getting even angrier now because suddenly in domestically all the people who are pissed off with the current order suddenly not only aren't listening to them on domestic issues, we're seeing now like increasingly a rejection of the narrative around Russia from people all the way across the political spectrum in Britain. Even like some very confused right-wing people like are rejecting it for their own reasons. And that's why they're getting more and more desperate. It's the reason why like all the Europeans and the American powers are doing stuff like setting up disinformation units, trying to censor like online media more and more, but totally ineffectually because they don't know what they're doing. And the people who are running it are grifters. But and they're clamping down on like what remains of civil liberties ever more because they're getting more and more desperate. So that's where this is going to go, like an increasing desperation against like even a rising tide of domestic dissent as access to all these markets they've been able to dominate slowly disappears, and that's our next phase.
Alexander, it's almost been 2 hours. Thank you so much. I can't. We just. This is very fun. It's always fun to talk about the decline of the UK.
Always fun to provide it.
Schadenfreude levels are through the roof. Red Star Radio. Check it out. It's a great podcast. I'm proud to be a patron. Thank you again, Alexander. You're always welcome to come on the show.
Thanks very much. Always good discussion.
All right, take care and press stop.